Hey there. Before we slip into something more historical, let's ease the tempo, dim the lights. Maybe put on that soft background hum, fan, rain, Gregorian monks doing ambient throat singing, whatever works for you. Stretch a little, loosen the shoulders, maybe unbutton the top of your tunic if you're still in one now. Tonight we begin not with a timeline, not with kings or wars, but with fog. A warm, slow, herbal fog. We're going to drift, not march, through one of the lesser known. And let's face it, delightfully weird corners of history. What it was like to get high in the Middle Ages. Yes, they did that. But not with vape pens and snack drawers. No, sir. In a world with no electricity, no caffeine, no antidepressants, and entertainment that ranged from watching sheep get shorn to possibly dying of a mysterious bread curse. Medieval people turned to nature for relief, and nature, being the generous but slightly chaotic force that it is, delivered. We're talking herbs, roots, flowers, seeds, and fungi. Some of which healed, some of which turned you into a prophet, and some of which made you try to fly out a window wearing a hat made of geese. This wasn't fringe behavior either. These substances weren't reserved for rebellious teens sneaking behind the stables. They were everywhere. In monasteries, in apothecary shops, in grandma's medicine chest, and they weren't even called drugs or intoxicants. They had charming names like flying balm, angel's root, and the dream herb, which sounds mystical until you realize it's probably just something that made you think your neighbor was Satan's footman. Now you might be thinking, surely people knew the risks. They must have had guides, precautions, and warnings. Number they had a vibe and a vague idea that the more it burned going down, the better the vision would be, dosage, eyeballed, side effects. Mostly observed when someone started speaking fluent Latin and running naked through a wheat field. And while today we have dispensaries and disclaimers, back then your local supplier might have been a barefoot nun, a brooding forest witch, or a peasant named Ulrich, who just had a feeling about that mushroom by the creek. So tonight, instead of battles and treaties, we're exploring that strange twilight space where medicine meets mysticism, where pain relief and poor judgment shake hands, a time when getting high wasn't a rebellious act, it was a ritual, a remedy, or sometimes just Tuesday. This is not the history you learned in school. This is the history that curled up under a blanket of fog, mumbled something about mandrakes, and floated away humming. So settle in because we're just beginning. It's easy, comforting even, to picture the Middle Ages as a dim cabbage-scented fever dream of suffering. A world ruled by plague, superstition, and the occasional sword fight outside a tavern. In this mental diorama, everyone is either a monk, a knight, or someone dying of something damp. And to be fair, yes, that happened. But that's not the whole story, because under all that wool and despair lived something far more interesting: real people. Curious people, bored people. People who occasionally looked at a wrinkled root and thought, well, what happens if I boil this in wine and drink it before confession? And that's where things get interesting. The average medieval person was not just trudging through filth, waiting for the next bad omen. They were experimenting quietly, clumsily, often dangerously, with the world around them. They didn't have Netflix, but they had mead. They didn't have medicine as we know it, but they had herbs. And sometimes those herbs did more than just soothe a rash. Sometimes they sent you into what modern pharmacology would call a deeply concerning neurological episode. But for them, that was just Saturday. This wasn't countercultural, by the way. This wasn't a rebellion. It was culture. Everyone from monks to midwives used mind-altering substances, though they wouldn't call them that. They called them cures, tonics, sacraments. Sometimes the Lord's mercy in a cup. Occasionally, oops, You didn't need to visit a back alley or wear a cloak at midnight. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a very loose sense of caution. Or better yet, an herb woman, usually older, barefoot, and suspiciously well-versed in mushrooms. She'd pull something out of a pouch, mumble a blessing, and offer you a tea that might cure your melancholy, or make you temporarily believe you were married to a goat. And society mostly went along with it, because in a world with no anesthesia, no mental health services, and a very vague grasp of biology, sometimes a little blurry vision, and a conversation with a nearby tree felt like progress. Of course, the church had mixed feelings about all this. If your visions came from a saint, wonderful. If they came from a root, well, that's heresy with extra steps. But even the church had apothecaries, even monks had herb gardens. The lines were fuzzy, and most people preferred to keep them that way. So before we go any further, remember this: the medieval world wasn't just about survival, it was about sensation, discovery, distraction, a constant improvisation against pain, monotony, and the crushing weight of eternal damnation. And if a flower helped take the edge off, even better. This is the Middle Ages no one told you about. The soft, fragrant, foggy one. And things are just starting to get weird. So where were we? Ah, yes. Somewhere between the cabbage fields and the confessional, where the average medieval soul, armed with little more than curiosity and a questionable understanding of chemistry, looked to the natural world for answers. And that's where the fun begins. Because once you accept that medieval people were not just passive victims of their environment, but rather active experimenters in it, you start to see the landscape differently. That patch of weeds behind the cottage, apothecary gold, that gnarled root in the woods, a potential cure for melancholy, or a one-way ticket to speaking fluent Latin with your eyes rolled back. The truth is, medieval Europe was teeming with plants, flowers, fungi, and resins that could either ease your pain or make you believe you'd turned into a lizard. Often both. There were no standardized doses, no purity tests, just trial, error, and oral tradition. A grandmother's whispered instructions, a monk's ink, stained herbal, a wandering healer's smug confidence, and sometimes, just sometimes, a vague memory of what happened the last time you tried that flower in tea form. These substances weren't treated with casual modern detachment. They were mysterious, sacred, and often dangerous. They had names like Devil's Eye, Angel's Trumpet, and Blessed Thistle. They were used in small, bitter sips or burned in censers that turned churches into fragrant fog machines. You didn't always know what you were inhaling, but if it calmed your nerves during a 5-hour sermon on damnation, you probably didn't ask too many questions. It's important to note that none of this felt unusual to them. We tend to project our modern caution onto the past, imagining that people must have known they were playing with fire. And maybe they did. But fire, in those days, was also how you cooked your soup. Risk was just part of the recipe. The mortar and pestle became the medieval equivalent of a laboratory. Every apothecary shop, monastery kitchen, and wise woman's hut was its own little research station, except without ethics boards or clear labelling. Roots were ground, flowers were steeped. Resins were boiled until the room filled with a heavy, sleep-inducing perfume. No one knew what neurotransmitters were, but they knew if you drank a particular brew at sunset, you might not wake up screaming. And that was good enough. And what were they looking for? Really relief. From pain, from sorrow, from the numbing sameness of daily life, from hunger, from grief, from a very long, very uncomfortable winter, and occasionally from the sense that the sky was far too quiet and the divine hadn't visited in a while. So yes, sometimes it was medicine, sometimes it was magic, and sometimes it was a very bad idea with pretty flowers on top. But this was how they lived, through trial and tincture, through bruised petals and boiling pots, through hope and hallucination. The line between healing and high wasn't just thin. It was practically decorative. And next we're going to meet some of the stars of this foggy pharmacopoeia, beginning with a plant so unpredictable it became medieval Europe's favourite botanical dare henbane. So we've wandered into the garden. The leaves are fragrant, the flowers oddly inviting, and the roots. Well, the roots are whispering things. And right there in the middle, growing as if daring you to pick it, is one of the most infamous players in the medieval herbal lineup, henbane. Now, if you're imagining something delicate and flowery, adjust your expectations. Henbane looks like a plant that knows too much. Its leaves are sticky and foul smelling, its pale yellowish flowers are veined with a bruised purple, like something that might bloom in the corner of a cursed painting. And to medieval people, it was both feared and revered. A botanical roulette wheel with deeply mixed reviews. They called it Hyoscyamus niger, if they were feeling scholarly. But most folks just called it that stuff that made Bernard try to baptize a chicken. Henbane had a reputation. In small doses, it was medicinal. Truly, it was used to dull toothaches, insomnia, calm nerves, and sometimes even assist in childbirth. Think of it as the medieval version of a sleep aid, pain reliever, and light tranquilizer. Except no one really knew how much was too much until someone ended up speaking in tongues to a tree stump. Because in higher doses, or let's be honest, average doses guessed by a sleepy monk, it went from gentle calm to full-blown chaos. Henbane contains alkaloids like scopolamine and hyoscyamine, which interfere with the brain's ability to process reality in a comfortable, linear fashion. Vision blurs, time loops. The thirst becomes unbearable, and occasionally you find yourself deeply convinced that your cousin is a turnip and must be exorcised. People smoked it, drank it, cooked it into stews, or applied it directly to the skin with fat. Yes, fat, often animal-based, because nothing says self-care like a pork-smeared hallucination. It was also a frequent ingredient in so-called flying ointments, which we'll get to soon. But suffice it to say, the sky was not the limit. It was the entry point. And here's the thing. Despite the madness it could induce, henbane was everywhere. It grew wild across Europe. Monks documented it in herbals with meticulous detail. Physicians prescribed it for headaches. Witches and herbalists used it in rituals. Peasants stumbled across it by accident, and then sometimes just stumbled in general. It was the people's plant, reluctantly embraced, nervously respected, occasionally regretted. The church, of course, had opinions. Anything that altered the mind too much was eyed with suspicion. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs, and yet henbane continued to thrive. Part poison, part prayer, always a gamble. It wasn't just a curse or a curse. It was a mirror. It reflected medieval desperation, curiosity, and that quietly enduring human impulse to explore the boundaries of the known, preferably with a steaming mug of something questionably herbal. And henbane was just the beginning, because deep in the soil, tangled in legend and botanical horror, waits a root that doesn't just whisper. It screams. Next, mandrake. If henbane was the unsettling houseguest of the medieval garden, frequently invited, rarely trusted, then mandrake was its dramatic, operatic cousin, mysterious, theatrical, and very likely cursed. After all, how many plants come with a warning label that says, "Will scream when pulled, may cause death by noise"? Picking up from where we left off, henbane played with your senses. It blurred lines, softened pain, and whispered nonsense. But mandrake? Mandrake shouted, according to legend, quite literally. The mandrake root, or Mandragora officinarum, was famous long before medieval Europe got its mud, caked hands on it. Ancient cultures knew about it, used it, feared it, and passed stories down through generations about its uncanny power. But it was in the Middle Ages that the myth took root, pun absolutely intended. People believed the mandrake looked like a small, contorted human figure. Some roots resembled squat little bodies with thick arms and legs and a headish nub at the top. If you saw one freshly unearthed, still coated in dirt and clinging to the shape of a person, you might forgive the panic. You might also tie it to a dog and back away slowly. Yes, that was the preferred method of harvesting. Tie the root to an animal, usually a dog, walk a safe distance away and call the dog. The force of the pull, it was said, would yank the mandrake free, causing it to unleash a deadly scream. The dog, poor thing, would drop dead. The harvester, meanwhile, would be fine traumatized, probably, but alive. Did it actually scream number? But that hardly mattered. What mattered was the belief, the fear, the drama, the ritual, because mandrake wasn't just another root. It was a relic, a talisman, a borderline deity to some and a tool of the devil to others. Used carefully, it was a potent medicine. It could ease pain, bring on sleep, even induce a trance. Like state physicians boiled it in wine to create a makeshift anesthetic. Others carried bits of dried root for protection or fertility. There were even tiny humanoid figures carved from mandrake and worn as charms, like little botanical voodoo dolls tucked into leather pouches. Used recklessly, though, mandrake could cause vomiting, dizziness, visions, and, in higher doses, unconsciousness. The line between healing and harm, as always in medieval pharmacology, was paper, thin and deeply dependent on how brave or desperate you were feeling. The church didn't quite know what to do with it. Too useful to ban outright, too weird to fully embrace. Some monks wrote about mandrake with cautious admiration. Others warned of its association with witchcraft, sin, and Satan's vegetable garden. And still, it was used again and again, because sometimes the fear was worth it. Mandrake wasn't just a root, it was a riddle, a puzzle wrapped in folklore, soaked in wine, and buried deep in the garden's darkest corner. It invited wonder, demanded caution, and promised visions. And if you could get past the screaming, it just might show you the face of God, or at least a very talkative pigeon. But if mandrake was theatrical, our next plant was pure mischief, allure and danger dressed in beauty, a flower that whispered sweet nothings and occasionally caused death. Say hello to belladonna. If mandrake was the medieval plant with a flair for drama, then belladonna was the dangerous beauty in the corner, the one that smiled sweetly while slipping something unsettling into your goblet. You see, the deeper you travel into the world of medieval intoxicants, the more you realize just how thin the veil was between remedy and ruin. Henbane was a gamble, mandrake was a mythic dare, but Belladonna was seduction itself, wrapped in velvet petals and just daring you to try. Its name means beautiful lady in Italian. Romantic, right? The story goes that women would extract the juice from the berries and drip it into their eyes to dilate their pupils. Wide eyes were considered alluring, ethereal, and mysterious. The medieval beauty standard with a side effect of temporary blindness and occasionally death. Vision may have been blurred, but so were the ethics of this particular cosmetic practice. You were, quite literally, applying poison to your face to be more dateable, and not a subtle poison either. Belladonna, also known as Atropa belladonna, or deadly nightshade, contains atropine and scopolamine, two alkaloids that once in your system begin to rearrange your understanding of basic reality. In the right or wrong amount, belladonna can cause dry mouth, dilated pupils, sensitivity to light, hallucinations, confusion, and a sense of floating. In larger doses, it could put you to sleep permanently. But, like everything in the medieval pharmacological toolkit, it had its uses. Belladonna wasn't just a cosmetic indulgence, it was also employed in medicine. It dulled pain, soothed fevers, and was occasionally used as an anesthetic. Apothecaries blended it into tinctures for all sorts of ailments, most of which were not well understood, but involved the word humours being thrown around a lot. More curiously, belladonna was a star ingredient in what became known as flying ointments. Remember those? The infamous blends of fat and herbs applied not orally, but, how shall we say this, transdermally and somewhat intimately mixed with henbane and mandrake. Belladonna completed the trifecta of hallucinogenic troublemakers. Together, they created the illusion of flight, of night journeys, of feasting with devils, or soaring over the treetops. No broomstick required, just the right paste in the right place. The church was understandably unsettled. A plant that could cause visions, paralysis, unconsciousness, and dreams of demonic banquets didn't exactly align with Sunday sermons. Like mandrake, belladonna occupied a strange space, sometimes useful, always suspect. Monks documented it. Witches cherished it. Physicians handled it with cautious reverence, hoping not to be the next victim of an overly generous dosage. Belladonna is a reminder that beauty in the Middle Ages was rarely gentle. It was edged with danger, rooted in folklore, and often soaked in pain. In a world with no modern medicine, every attempt to heal was also an invitation to risk everything. You drank the tea, applied the ointment, and hoped you'd wake up feeling better, not levitating above your bed reciting Latin backwards. But if belladonna was the quiet killer in the medicine chest, what came next was more of a team sport. A curious cocktail of herbs, oils, and animal fat, applied with religious intensity and very questionable technique. Yes, it's time to talk about ointments, the famous, infamous, and utterly bizarre flying kind. By now, we've met the three herbaceous harbingers of medieval misadventure: henbane, mandrake, and belladonna. Alone, each one could nudge you gently off the ledge of normal consciousness. But together they became something far more theatrical, alchemical, and vaguely obscene: the flying ointment. This was not an over-the-counter balm. This was not something you rubbed into your temples and sighed contentedly. This was the sort of ointment that had instructions spoken in hushed tones, often involving a full moon, animal fat, and areas of the body one typically doesn't discuss in polite company. Yet for many practitioners, herbalists, midwives, and yes, those labelled witches, this concoction was a potent and revered tool, thought to transport the user into other realms. Not literally, of course, probably, but to the medieval mind, lines between real and imagined were gloriously, dangerously thin. Flying ointments were never ingested. Even the boldest peasant knew better than to drink something containing all three of those aforementioned plants. Instead, they were applied to the skin, where their psychoactive compounds could be absorbed more gently, though gently here is a relative term. The preferred method was through the mucous membranes, areas of high absorption and high privacy. Let's just say if a broomstick is involved, it's not because anyone was sweeping. This peculiar delivery method wasn't invented for shock value. It was practical. Sort of ingesting belladonna could kill you, rubbing it into your ahem, more absorbent regions. It would just make you think you were flying naked through the sky with Satan's catering team. A trade-off, perhaps, but one people were willing to make. and the sensations these ointments produced weren't subtle. Users described vivid visions of soaring, feasting, dancing, of riding beasts, or attending grand gatherings. The experiences were euphoric, frightening, often religious, and deeply personal. It's worth noting that many who used these salves didn't think of them as getting high. That wasn't the framework. These were spiritual journeys, sacred rituals, or necessary escapes from lives that offered very little joy and even fewer options. Of course, the church saw things differently. A woman experiencing ecstatic visions while half-naked in a barn after rubbing herself with pig fat and poison. Not divine, demonic. Such experiences were catalogued in inquisitorial records, not as therapeutic misadventures, but as evidence of witchcraft. Never mind that many of these women were simply trying to treat insomnia, grief, or chronic pain. If you looked too free, too strange, too blissful in the face of suffering, you became a target. But the ointment persisted, secretly passed down, reformulated, whispered about. And even today, in certain corners of folklore and medicine, its legacy lingers, half history, half hallucination. So, while belladonna might have blurred your vision, the flying ointment blurred the world. And in a society anchored by suffering, submission, and sin, the sensation of flight, however illusory, must have felt like salvation. So here we are, hovering, quite literally, at the edge of folklore and pharmacology. We've steeped ourselves in the rich, mind-bending world of medieval ointments, but now we follow the most infamous accessory in that dreamy drug-soaked ensemble, the broomstick. You've seen the image 100 times. The crooked witch, wild-haired and cackling, soaring across a pale moon on a broomstick, like it's business class to hell. But what no one tells you, at least not in children's books, is that this image wasn't just invented for drama. It was rooted in a very specific, very awkward method of drug delivery. You see, those ointments we just discussed. The ones with henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and maybe a dollop of pig fat for spreadability. They weren't just rubbed on wrists or dabbed behind the ears. The most efficient method of absorption was internal, or at least mucosal. The armpits, behind the knees, the more intimate regions, places where the skin is thin, the blood vessels are close, and modesty has already left the building. Enter the broomstick, not as a magical vehicle, but as a kind of medieval applicator. Yes, the broomstick was anointed, as they delicately put it, and straddled. The salve was delivered right where it would do the most efficient pharmacological work. The resulting hallucinations often involved flight. Or so the records say. Women described feeling as though they were soaring weightless, taken beyond the physical body. Some claimed they attended great feasts. Others saw angels or devils or spoke to the dead. Many woke up hours later in barns or fields, or just deeply confused. Of course, these weren't private experiences. Word got around, and in a society already suspicious of women, herbs, and anything that smelled like independence, these ointment rituals became the perfect target for fear and suspicion. It didn't help that inquisitors and clergymen, deeply uncomfortable with the idea of women experiencing euphoria without clerical supervision, documented these practices with a blend of horror and titillation. Flying became not just a metaphor for escape, but a chargeable offense. And so the image was born, a woman alone in the night, drenched in strange substances, her face flushed, her eyes wild, and a broom between her legs, as she rises from her cottage and disappears into the stars. The flying witch, the midnight rider. Her story is half accusation, half legend. It's easy to laugh now, to roll our eyes and chalk it up to ignorance. But imagine, just for a moment, what it meant to fly in a world that did everything it could to keep you grounded. A world where your body, your pain, your mind were never entirely your own. And then, through the careful blending of root and resin, fire and fat, you slipped the bounds of the earth. Whether the world believed you flew or not didn't really matter, because for those few precious hours you did. After all the salves and ointments, let's pour ourselves a cup of something questionable, because flying through the sky via broomstick was only one avenue of medieval intoxication, the other liquid courage or confusion, or sudden, unexpected Latin. Not everyone had access to carefully blended ointments and fat-based hallucinogens. Sometimes you had to work with what you had, dried herbs, a borrowed cauldron, and a generous understanding of measurement. And so potions became the common medieval route to altered consciousness. They were brewed in kitchens, in monastery gardens, in forest huts filled with bundles of drying plants and suspicious jars. Think of it as backyard alchemy, only instead of gold, the goal was usually pain relief, divine inspiration, or temporary forgetfulness. Most of these potions began with wine or ale, the universal medieval base liquid. Water wasn't trustworthy, wine was. Spiced wine, honey wine, herbal wine, each one a canvas waiting for someone to whisper. What happens if we add just a pinch of henbane? Often, that pinch turned into a generous spoonful. The resulting brews were thick, murky, and strong enough to either knock you out or send you into an impromptu theological debate with your own reflection. These weren't always recreational. Often they were medicinal or spiritual. A monk with a migraine might be handed a cup of mulled wine laced with poppy extract. A grieving widow might be offered a dream draught infused with valerian mandrake and a very calming prayer. Rituals were woven in. Words were chanted. Not necessarily magic, but not exactly medicine either. The boundary was loose, like most things in medieval life. Recipes varied wildly. A wandering herbalist might swear by boiling a root 3 times under a waxing moon, while a village healer might just soak it in wine and call it a day. Measurements were rarely exact, a handful, a sprig, a bit more if the pain is loud, and no one wrote down what to do if the tea made you speak in riddles or attempt to marry a fence posts. Still, the appeal of these potions was undeniable. For people living with chronic pain, untreated trauma, and the daily ache of survival, these brews offered moments of peace, or at least distraction, to see visions of glowing saints, to float outside your body, to feel warmth instead of sorrow. That was a gift, even if it came with a side of hallucinated frogs reciting scripture. Not all potions were benign. Some were dangerous, fatal even, and some were sold by travelling quacks, promising cures for heartbreak, plague, and anything else you couldn't pronounce. These elixirs were often theatrical, presented in glass vials, sealed with wax, and accompanied by a confident grin. Did they work occasionally? But mostly they just made you forget what was wrong. And sometimes that was enough. Next we'll stumble into something a little less deliberate and a lot more terrifying. What happened when your bread got moldy, your rye got cursed, and your breakfast turned into a biblical fever dream? Welcome to the accidental trip of ergotism. Not all medieval highways were planned. In fact, some of the most dramatic, unsettling, and occasionally apocalyptic experiences came not from tinctures or potions, but from bread. Yes, bread. The stuff you eat with cheese. The stuff you bake with love. The stuff that, when things went wrong, turned entire villages into hallucinating mobs who danced until they collapsed. The culprit was ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains. To the medieval eye, ergot didn't look like much, just a slightly darker, oddly shaped kernel mixed in with the rest of the harvest. nothing worth noticing. But inside that innocent-looking speck was a cocktail of alkaloids powerful enough to cause convulsions, hallucinations, burning limbs, and sensations that would not be out of place in a modern experimental theatre production called Why Are My Hands Spiders? The thing is, no one knew ergot existed. They didn't understand mold on a microbial level. There were no warning labels or fungal inspectors, just the urgency to grind the flour and bake the bread before winter took a turn. And so in damp, cool regions where ergot thrived, particularly in parts of France and the Germanic territories, people unknowingly fed their entire family's psychedelic fungus in loaf form. Breakfast became the opening act to a day of deeply confusing events. There were two major types of ergotism, now politely known as ergot poisoning, though neither sounds especially polite in practice. The first was convulsive, twitching, spasming, fits of laughter or terror and full on hallucinations. The second, more terrifying version was gangrenous. Blood flow would be cut off to the extremities, fingers and toes, blackening, limbs shriveling, sometimes falling off entirely. This was known, somewhat grimly, as Anthony's fire, named after the order of monks who tried to treat it, often by feeding patients clean wheat and praying the devil would go away. At the time, of course, no one blamed the bread. They blamed demons or witches or divine punishment. People danced in the streets uncontrollably, speaking nonsense and collapsing in heaps. Entire communities were seized by outbreaks of what looked like mass hysteria. The afflicted claimed they saw devils, angels, and fire raining from the sky. They wept, they raved, they ran into rivers. They also, quite understandably, terrified everyone else. These episodes were not isolated. Chroniclers wrote about them with the sort of horrified fascination reserved for things you can't unsee. Medical theories at the time included bad air, imbalance of humours, or simply moral failing. None of these addressed the fact that it was all caused by fungus in your bread bowl. And perhaps most unsettling of all, people just kept eating it because they were hungry, because ergot didn't show up every year, because the difference between safe bread and cursed bread was impossible to tell until it was already too late. So yes, the medieval world had its fair share of deliberate experimentation, but sometimes the most surreal journeys begin with a single bite of toast. So far, we've floated through ointments, potions, and accidentally cursed bread. But now we come to something even sneakier, something golden, glowing, and hiding in plain sight. Honey, that soothing spoonful in your tea, the drip on your toast, the symbol of natural purity. Except when it wasn't, because in certain parts of the medieval world, the bees were on the high. Enter mad honey, a charming nickname for a very specific, very intense kind of hallucinogenic honey produced in the mountainous regions along the Black Sea, particularly in what is now northeastern Turkey. The secret ingredient, rhododendron flowers, lovely to look at, mildly toxic to eat, and absolutely wild when converted into nectar by bees, who had no idea they were manufacturing a psychoactive substance. When these bees collected pollen from rhododendrons, the honey they produced became laced with gyanotoxins, a word that basically means this is going to get weird. And get weird it did, consumed in small amounts. Mad honey had a pleasant warming effect, a gentle buzz, a soothing calm. In larger amounts, however, things took a turn. Nausea, dizziness, hallucinations, slowed heart rate, and visions of variable spiritual quality, sometimes divine, sometimes more. I think the furniture is whispering to me. Either way, the honey had bite. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't entirely unknown. Locals who lived in these regions understood mad honey's effects. They treated it with respect, as both a medicine and a kind of spiritual aid. It was used in small doses for stomach ailments, anxiety, and sometimes as a ritual substance taken before divination or to prepare the mind for visions. It wasn't recreational so much as transformative, and, when misused, profoundly regrettable. Even more astonishing, this honey wasn't just consumed by the curious or the ailing, it was weaponized. According to classical sources later repeated in medieval chronicles, entire armies were allegedly taken down by mad honey traps. One tale involves a local people deliberately leaving behind pots of honey in a village they'd abandoned. The invading soldiers, tired, hungry, and understandably thrilled to find a surprise buffet, ate the honey. Within hours, they were curled up on the ground, hallucinating, vomiting, and deeply unavailable for battle. Their enemies returned and wiped them out without lifting a sword. It's one of those stories that hovers between legend and strategic brilliance. But even without military application, mad honey was known enough to be traded, stored in small ceramic jars sold in markets, sometimes without any warning label at all. Because who needs labels in a world where leeches and powdered toad were legitimate treatment options? So yes, in a time when everything from bread to ointment could alter your mind, honey quietly joined the roster, sweet, golden, and humming with ancient botanical mischief. And if you think only plants and bees were involved in this strange apothecary of the past, think again, because next we meet the people behind the potions. The cunning folk, the herbalists, the barefoot midwives who mixed, measured, and sometimes accidentally summoned visions of the afterlife. Behind every potion, salve, or suspiciously vibrating cup of tea in the medieval world, there was usually someone, a person standing in the shadows of the official systems, stirring something that wasn't entirely approved by church or state. They were the cunning folk, the herbalists, the midwives, the forest-dwelling women with baskets full of dried plants, and a look in their eye that said, "I know exactly what that rash is, and I know how to fix it." These were the underground pharmacists of the Middle Ages, not licensed, not sanctioned, but absolutely essential. When your child had a fever, when your joints ached, or when you wanted to speak to your dead uncle one last time to ask where he hid the rent money, you didn't go to the bishop, you went to her, or him. Because cunning men existed too. But let's be honest, this world ran on the quiet labour of women. They weren't witches, not exactly, not to their neighbours. In most villages, the local healer was a figure of trust. She had knowledge passed down through generations, learned by observation, sometimes written in notebooks that looked suspiciously like grimoires, but were really just full of family recipes involving foxglove and firm belief. She could mix a sleeping draught, ease a birth, stop a bleeding wound, or give you a brew that made you forget what was bothering you, including your name. And she knew the plants: henbane, mandrake, belladonna, poppy, mugwort, and more. She knew how to dose them, how to combine them, when to pick them, because even the moon's phase mattered. Her garden was her pharmacy, and the woods were her supplier. She worked with wine, with fat, with honey, with spit if it came to it. She didn't have gloves, goggles, or a sterile lab. She had instinct and results. But knowledge, especially embodied, unlicensed knowledge, made people nervous. Especially if it came from someone who didn't speak Latin, who didn't quote scripture, and who seemed a little too comfortable around poisonous plants. That unease grew in the margins of society. And when things went wrong, say, a patient saw flying goats or began singing to turnips, the blame didn't fall on the herb. It fell on the hand that administered it. Thus, the slow, creeping transformation from healer to witch. The moment society needed a scapegoat for a fever, a bad vision, or a miscarriage, the woman with too much knowledge and not enough modesty became dangerous. Even if she had just cured your headache last week, still, they practiced quietly. Carefully, these weren't rebels. They weren't trying to bring down the church or rewrite the laws of man. They were trying to help to soothe pain, to soften grief, and maybe sometimes to explore the foggy edge between this world and whatever came next. Next, we turn our eyes to the other side of that edge, where visions weren't just tolerated but celebrated. Because while common folk were hunted for hallucinations, some were praised for them, especially if they happened to be wearing robes and muttering in Latin. Welcome to the church's complicated relationship with getting high. So far, we've wandered through gardens, kitchens, and backwoods huts, meeting the quietly rebellious herbalists who dabbled in the ancient art of bodily escape. But now we step into the stone halls of power, the place with the stained glass, the incense, the solemn chants echoing off vaulted ceilings, the medieval church. And here, the story of getting high takes a different turn. Because oddly enough, the church was no stranger to altered states. In fact, it sort of encouraged them, under specific circumstances, of course. If you were a monk who hadn't eaten in 3 days, had been kneeling in prayer since sunrise, and suddenly began to glow while speaking in tongues, congratulations. That was divine. You were having a vision, perhaps even a mystical union with God. There might be a mural of you by next spring, but if you were a barefoot midwife who sipped a poppy, laced tea and started humming the same hymn in reverse while seeing angels made of fire, that was different. That was suspicious. That was heresy, possibly witchcraft, and definitely someone's business in the local court records. The difference wasn't the experience, it was the source. The church accepted altered states that came through suffering, fasting, and rigid devotion. But anything that involved herbs, roots, or potions was immediately suspect. Saints could have visions. Mystics could levitate. But if a peasant claimed to float after rubbing belladonna on her thighs, she was likely floating toward a stake and a very one-sided trial. This wasn't just about theology, it was about control. The church guarded access to the divine like a landlord guards his wine cellar. It feared substances that could induce visions without ecclesiastical permission. After all, if a root could give you an ecstatic encounter with the heavens, what did that say about relics, pilgrimages, or the long, expensive process of buying indulgences? Yet the church wasn't consistent. It used herbs too. Monks kept detailed herbals. Abbey gardens were full of medicinal plants, including henbane and mandrake. Apothecaries attached to monasteries dispensed concoctions for sleep, melancholy, and yes, visions. But these were carefully framed within spiritual discipline. There's a big difference, apparently, between a monk sipping a holy tincture in candlelight and a village woman accidentally discovering transcendence after chewing on the wrong flower. Still, lines blurred. There are records of clerics who quietly worked with cunning folk, seeking remedies outside official doctrine, priests who blessed herbal brews, nuns who passed along recipes in the margins of devotional texts. Despite public condemnation, there was a silent, persistent exchange between the sacred and the herbal. Because in the end, altered states were everywhere. Some were holy, some were sinful, and some were just poorly timed hallucinations during morning prayers. After all the potions and ointments, the secret rituals and herbal gambles, it's time we finally talk about the most socially accepted, widely consumed, and culturally beloved intoxicant of the Middle Ages: alcohol. Unlike henbane or mandrake, you didn't need a shady recipe or a whisper from a local hedge witch to get your hands on a good buzz. You just needed to live near a barrel beer, ale, mead, wine. These weren't reserved for feasts or celebration. They were everyday necessities. And not because everyone was looking to get tipsy before noon, but because water was unreliable. Most medieval water sources were riddled with bacteria, animal runoff, or worse. A stream might look clear and pure, but it was probably downstream from someone else's latrine. So instead, people reached for something fermented, safer to drink, easier to store, and gently intoxicating in a way that made enduring the 14th century slightly more bearable. The most common drink was small beer, a low, alcohol ale consumed by everyone from farmers to nuns to children. It was brewed quickly with little sugar and a short fermentation process, giving it a low enough alcohol content to hydrate without incapacitating you. Think of it as medieval LaCroix. If LaCroix came with the added benefit of dulling your toothache and your awareness of how drafty your cottage was. But for those with a little more time, money, or lack of responsibility, there were stronger brews, mead made from fermented honey, wines imported from sunnier regions, and robust ales brewed in monasteries, with serious attention to flavor and strength. Monks, in particular, took brewing seriously. It wasn't just nourishment, it was a form of devotion. They perfected recipes, documented fermentation methods, and built elaborate brewing systems, treating beer like a gift from God's more cheerful cousin. And so, day after day, night after night, medieval Europe drank, not to forget entirely, but to blur the edges, to soften the weight, to toast to survival in a world that never stopped demanding more than it gave. Next, we move from mugs to incense burners, where smoke wasn't just symbolic, and the sweet smell of holiness came with unexpected side effects. Welcome to the pleasantly hazy world of medieval religious fumes. Now that we've sipped our way through medieval alehouses and monastery breweries, it's time to enter a quieter space. Stone walls, flickering candlelight, and the thick curling smoke of incense wafting upward like a whispered prayer. You might think the only thing floating in a medieval church was the occasional hymn, but in truth there was something else lingering in the air, psychoactive fumes. Let's set the scene. You're a monk in a poorly ventilated chapel. You've been fasting for 2 days, you haven't slept properly in weeks, and your morning has involved a combination of chanting, kneeling, and being very, very pious. Around you, censers swing gently, releasing the fragrant smoke of frankincense and myrrh, 2 resins so sacred and expensive, they were said to be gifts fit for the Christ child himself. But aside from their heavenly scent and symbolic weight, they were also, according to modern studies, mildly psychoactive. Frankincense, for instance, contains compounds like incensyl acetate, which has been shown to affect the brain's limbic system in plain terms. It messes with your mood, it lifts, it softens, it soothes, and in sufficient doses, especially when paired with fasting, dehydration, and the meditative rhythm of chant, it just might coax you into a light trance, not quite flying through the rafters, but definitely hovering on the edge of somewhere else. And this wasn't limited to isolated monks or cloistered nuns. These resins were burned in cathedrals, parish churches, private chapels. They hung in the air during baptisms, weddings, funerals, and every Sunday service in between. For many medieval people, the scent of incense wasn't just holy, it was a full-body experience. Thick and sweet and slightly dizzying, it blurred time and softened focus. You came in thinking about taxes and goats. You left with a faint ringing in your ears and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, God had nudged your shoulder. The church, of course, fully embraced incense, not for its chemical properties, at least not officially, but for its symbolism, smoke rising like prayers, cleansing the air of evil spirits, preparing the space for the divine. And all of that was true, but there was also a quiet, unspoken benefit. It made long services slightly more tolerable. It helped devotees enter altered states that felt sacred, mysterious, otherworldly. No one called it getting high, but now and then someone probably left mass with the uncanny urge to write poetry about clouds. And incense wasn't just a Christian thing. Mosques used it. Synagogues used it. Pagan temples had used it long before. In every case, the smoke carried something. Hope, memory, breath, or maybe just the faint suggestion that the world beyond the walls was closer than it seemed. While Europe was busy stirring belladonna into wine and accusing its neighbors of goat-related witchcraft, something far more refined was unfolding further east, in the flourishing centers of the Islamic Golden Age. Places like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus, thinkers, poets, physicians, and mystics were building libraries, debating astronomy, and quietly getting high on hashish. Yais, hashish, derived from the resin of the cannabis plant. It wasn't smoked in a back alley or hidden in a sock drawer. It was mixed with honey, herbs, and spices, rolled into balls or spread onto pastries, and consumed in social, spiritual, and even scholarly settings. Unlike the grim teas and suspicious salves of medieval Europe, hashish came with flavor. It was the rare medieval intoxicant that didn't taste like compost or make you briefly believe your hands were made of bees. Hashish wasn't some underground secret either. It was widely known, widely used, and widely written about, especially among the Sufis, the mystics of Islam who sought direct ecstatic communion with the divine. For some of them, hashish was not an escape, but a tool, a way to loosen the grip of ego, to soften the mind's rigid thinking, and to open up space for contemplation, prayer, or just very intense staring at a carpet. And the poetry it inspired, rich, surreal, layered with meaning. Verses that sang of floating gardens, eternal love, and the shimmer of truth, glimpsed through a haze of sweet smoke. These weren't lazy hallucinations. They were deliberate journeys, inward and upward. The goal was not chaos, but clarity, a paradox only mystics could explain with a straight face. Of course, not everyone approved. While cannabis isn't explicitly forbidden in the Quran, many Islamic rulers and scholars viewed hashish with suspicion, especially when its use leaned more toward giggling than enlightenment. Periodic bans were issued. Edicts declared it morally corrosive. But much like prohibition in any century, these efforts had the success rate of throwing a rug over a volcano. People kept using it. Quietly, respectfully, or not. There are even legends, mostly apocryphal, of the Hashashin. The fabled assassins who allegedly used hashish before missions to achieve fearlessness or a trance. Like state, modern historians are skeptical of the story, and the term Hashashin may have been more of a political smear than a user's guide. Still, the myth stuck. And like all good myths, it said something true, even if it wasn't factual, that hashish had power, real, cultural, and symbolic power. In contrast to Europe's herbal roulette wheel, the Islamic world's relationship with mind, altering substances was more sophisticated, more documented, and arguably more honest. It wasn't always safe, but it was rarely accidental. People knew what they were doing, or at least what they were trying to do. Next, we drift back into the churches of medieval Europe, where incense wasn't the only thing lifting people from their pews. Because sometimes the divine came not through vision or vapor, but through a very enthusiastic sip of spiced wine and a 5-ha sermon. After all this wandering through hazy gardens, smoky chapels, and bliss, out honey shops, it's time to ask the real question. What did medieval people actually think about getting high? Was it sacred, scandalous, a Tuesday? The answer is, as with most things in the Middle Ages, frustratingly inconsistent. There wasn't one clear opinion about mind-altering substances. There were dozens. and they often contradicted each other. It all came down to context. Who you were, what you were using, and whether anyone happened to notice. For healers and herbalists, altered states were just part of the toolkit. If a tea made you stop screaming during childbirth or helped you sleep through the pain of a broken rib, great. That wasn't indulgence, it was medicine. And if you accidentally spoke to your dead grandmother in the process, well, maybe she had something important to say. Spiritual seekers, monks, mystics, the deeply devout, also had their own brand of transcendence. Long fasts, isolation, chanting, incense, and extreme devotion could absolutely bring on visions. When a nun collapsed in ecstasy and described a radiant figure offering her divine wisdom, people nodded reverently. When a peasant woman described the same thing after drinking infused ale, people reached for the firewood. Intent mattered. If you were using herbs or potions to manage pain, escape grief, or connect with the divine, you might be tolerated, especially if you wrapped the experience in religious language and didn't cause too much of a scene. But if your hallucinations involved flying goats, naked sky journeys, or inappropriate theological revelations, the tolerance wore thin. Class played a major role too. A nobleman hallucinating after drinking too much spiced wine was overcome by melancholy. A village woman who did the same was consorting with demons. Wealth came with interpretation. The same symptoms meant something different depending on the robes you wore and the Latin you could speak. There was also an understanding, however unspoken, that the world was hard and people needed escape. Maybe not openly, maybe not every day, but quietly, with a nod, a cup, or a bundle of dried leaves tied with a prayer. People mourned, hurt, aged, and struggled under heavy skies. Sometimes a little forgetfulness was mercy. Of course, things could turn. The same healer who was beloved for her soothing teas could become a witch overnight if someone's child didn't recover. The line between respect and fear was hair thin, and the church's approval was never a sure thing, no matter how many incense sticks were lit. So how did they really feel about getting high? Ambivalent, curious, guilty, grateful, quietly thrilled. It wasn't rebellion, it was relief or communion, or sometimes just very poor decision making on an empty stomach. We've wandered through a strange and fragrant landscape, one lined not with banners and armies, but with roots, resins, bubbling pots, and occasionally naked flights of fancy. This hasn't been a history of battles or monarchs. It's been a history of the fog, of what people reached for when the world got too loud, too painful, too deeply medieval. And what did they reach for? The garden. Because in the Middle Ages there were no pharmacies, no wellness brands with calming pastel packaging, no therapists or prescribed escapism, just plants. Herbs that grew behind cottages, mushrooms that bloomed under damp trees, and roots that looked a little too much like human legs. Nature didn't just offer food or shelter, it offered ways to shift your reality, subtly, wildly, or somewhere in between. Some people used those plants to sleep through sorrow. Others used them to dream of things too holy or too strange for daylight. Still, others just wanted to get through the evening without their teeth hurting. And the beauty of it all, the strange, terrible, very human beauty, is that they kept experimenting, even when they didn't fully understand what they were playing with. A few got answers. Many got visions. Some got burned. But always there was a kind of faith. Not religious necessarily, but ancestral. The quiet belief that the earth knew something we didn't. That inside a root or a resin or a sticky leaf was a secret passed down from a time before language. People didn't use henbane or mandrake because they were bored. They used them because the world hurt. And if a bit of boiled nightshade could make the edges of that world blur, if only for an hour, that was something worth risking. Even the church, with all its incense and suspicion, understood this dance. It tried to regulate it, sanctify it, or stamp it out, but it never really succeeded, because altered states weren't a trend, they were a need. You can see it in the visions of fasting nuns, in the trembling hands of peasants, drinking herb-laced ale in the hashish-sweetened poetry of Sufi mystics, and in the dry, cautious notes of monks cataloguing plants they weren't quite sure were holy or hellish. And maybe the most curious thing, they didn't think of these substances the way we do. There was no clear division between drug and medicine, between high and healing. A tea might soothe your headache or invite a conversation with St. Michael. A potion might help you sleep or convince you you'd turned into a duck. They didn't have modern categories. They had experience, memory, word. Of-mouth warnings like "don't drink that on an empty stomach" or "only take this if the moon is waning." In the end, the history of getting high in the Middle Ages is not a cautionary tale, it's a survival story. It's the record of people trying to soften the sharp edges of their reality with whatever they had growing nearby. A story of risk, of curiosity, of reaching out towards something other. Not just to escape the world, but sometimes to understand it better. So if tonight you sleep deeply, dream strangely, or wake up with the vague sense that your candle whispered something prophetic, that's all right. You've just spent some time in the garden, and like every good medieval mystic, you're probably better for it. Thanks for drifting through this foggy, fascinating corner of history with us. If you're feeling a little floaty yourself, or just oddly comforted by the idea that medieval people were also trying to chill out in chaotic times, you're not alone. The past was weird and honestly kind of relatable. If you enjoyed this episode of Boring Story for Sleep, don't forget to follow, rate, or share it with a fellow insomniac or history nerd. Sweet dreams. And remember, if your tea starts whispering back, maybe give it a minute before that second sip. Good night.